My name is Andrew Foster. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my career, I've worked inside structured organizations, places with clear hierarchies, polished language, and a strong belief that hard work eventually speaks for itself. I've spent years in roles that sit just close enough to decision-making to feel important, but far enough away to remain invisible. People usually see me as steady, dependable, the kind of person who doesn't need much supervision. I'm not loud in meetings. I don't dominate conversations. I listen more than I speak, and when I do speak, it's usually to solve a problem, not to be noticed for solving it. That combination tends to make people comfortable, and comfort, I've learned, can quietly turn into entitlement. This story isn't about being wronged in some dramatic, obvious way. No shouting matches, no public humiliation, no single moment where everything breaks. Instead, it's about something far more common and far more difficult to explain. What happens when responsibility keeps increasing, expectations keep rising, and recognition somehow never arrives? When you're told you're trusted, relied upon, essential, even while your title and pay remain exactly where they were. I was promised advancement. Not in a formal announcement, not in writing, but in the language organizations often use when they want more without committing to anything concrete. Let's see how this goes. This will position you well. Just a little more time. What I received instead was exploitation delivered so gradually that it almost felt reasonable at first. Over the course of this story, I'll walk you through how that dynamic formed, how it normalized itself, and how I participated in it longer than I should have. Not because I lacked self-respect, but because I believed patience was maturity. I believed that staying calm, staying useful, staying professional would eventually lead to alignment between effort and reward. I'm not sharing this to dramatize my past or to paint anyone as a villain. There are no cartoon antagonists here, just systems, incentives, and human behavior operating exactly as they tend to when silence fills the gaps where boundaries should be. I won't exaggerate events, and I won't hide my own misjudgments. This is an honest accounting, not a performance. You'll hear how small moments, things most people would brush off, accumulated into a pattern I could no longer ignore. You'll hear about the internal shift that happened long before anything changed on the surface. And you'll hear how quiet decisions, made without confrontation or spectacle, can sometimes be the most decisive ones of all. This isn't a revenge story. It's a story about restraint, clarity, and timing, about understanding when loyalty turns into self-erasure, and about learning that power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply withdraws its labor, its insight, its presence, and lets the absence speak. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, calmly, and without judgment. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that you were carrying more responsibility than your role was ever meant to hold? To them, I was reliable, not impressive, not threatening. Just reliable in the way a well-built bridge is reliable. Useful, necessary, and rarely looked at unless something goes wrong. I was the person people CC'd when they weren't sure who owned a problem. The one manager asked to take a quick look at something that somehow turned into a week of work. The name that came up when deadlines were tight and failure wasn't an option. In meetings, I sat slightly back from the table, not because I lacked confidence, but because I didn't feel the need to perform it. I spoke when I had something precise to say, and I stopped when it was said. That made me easy to overlook in rooms where presence was measured by airtime rather than substance. No one ever said I was junior, but no one said I was a senior either. My title stayed modest, my workload did not. When people introduced me to others, they used phrases like, "Andrew helps keep things running," or "Andrew knows how this works." Never "Andrew leads this," never "Andrew owns that." I was adjacent to ownership without ever being granted it. Close enough to carry responsibility, far enough to be excluded from authority. And here's the uncomfortable truth. I allowed that framing. Not out of fear, out of belief. I believed that if I stayed consistent, if I didn't push, if I proved, over time, that I could be trusted with more, recognition would follow naturally. I believed that competence was self-evident, that good work created its own gravity, that eventually someone would notice the pattern and say, "We should formalize what Andrew is already doing." So when my manager leaned into my cubicle one afternoon and said, "Can you temporarily oversee this process? Just until we figure out the structure," I said yes. When another team started routing their issues through me because you explain things clearly, I said yes. When expectations expanded, but conversations about compensation stalled, I told myself it was strategic patience. From the outside, it probably looked like ambition. From the inside, it felt like stewardship, like protecting systems from breaking, like being the adult in the room when others rotated, reorganized, or moved on. I wasn't chasing visibility, I was preserving continuity. People trusted me with the things they didn't want to think about, and slowly, subtly, I became invisible in the most dangerous way, not ignored, but assumed. Assumed to be available, assumed to be agreeable, assumed to be fine. No one checked whether the added weight was sustainable. They only checked whether the work still got done. And it did. Quietly, on time, without drama, which, in a strange way, made the imbalance harder to see. I wasn't struggling. I wasn't burnt out. Yet. I didn't complain. I didn't escalate. That made my situation unremarkable, even as it became increasingly misaligned. Even as it became. Looking back now, I can see how neatly I fit the role they needed me to fill. I absorbed complexity so others could stay clean. I translated chaos into order and handed it off without demanding credit. I became the solution to problems that didn't officially exist. And when you solve unofficial problems, you rarely get official rewards. What's important here is this. No one sat me down and decided to exploit me. This wasn't malice. It was momentum. A system responding efficiently to the path of least resistance. I was on that path. I don't say this with resentment. I say it with clarity. Because before anything else happened, before promises, before disappointment, before silence became intentional, this is who I was to them. Useful, calm, replaceable in theory, indispensable in practice, and completely underestimated. The first moment didn't announce itself. There was no sting, no immediate sense of injustice. If anything, it was easy to miss, easy to dismiss, which is probably why it stayed with me. It happened in a routine meeting, a status update, the kind everyone half listens to while checking their laptops. I had spent the previous 2 weeks stabilizing a process that had quietly failed 3 times before anyone admitted it was broken. I mapped the dependencies, rebuilt the workflow and coordinated with 2 teams that didn't normally talk to each other. The result wasn't flashy, but it worked. When it was time to explain what had changed, I spoke plainly. No jargon, no credit seeking, just facts. A few minutes later, my manager summarized the discussion for leadership. He described the solution accurately, but spoke as if it had emerged organically, as if the system had simply corrected itself. My name wasn't mentioned, not once. I remember waiting for it. Not because I needed praise, but because attribution matters, ownership matters. And in that room, silence can quietly rewrite reality. No one corrected it. The meeting moved on. Budgets, timelines. Other voices filled the space. And just like that, the moment passed. If you asked anyone else in the room, they wouldn't remember anything unusual. Nothing technically wrong had happened. My manager hadn't taken explicit credit. He hadn't lied. He'd simply smoothed the story into something more convenient, something that didn't require explanation. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I didn't need my name attached to everything. That the work speaks for itself was enough. That senior people notice patterns, not moments. I told myself that pushing back would make me look insecure, territorial, and difficult. So I stayed quiet. But the cut was already there. Not deep, not bleeding, just enough to be felt if I pressed on it. A few weeks later, it happened again. A different context. A different problem. Same outcome. My analysis was referenced. My conclusions were used. My presence was implied, not acknowledged. This time, someone even said, "We should thank the team for pulling this together." And the room nodded. Team. A convenient word. Wide enough to include everyone. Specific enough to include no one. I nodded too. That's the part that matters. I participated in my own erasure by choosing harmony over clarity. I wasn't afraid of conflict. I was avoiding friction. There's a difference, and it took me a long time to understand it. What made the moment cut deeper wasn't the lack of recognition. It was the assumption that I wouldn't mind, that I was the kind of person who didn't need to be seen to stay engaged. And maybe, at that point, they were right, because when my manager later asked me to take point on another initiative, this one larger, riskier, more visible, I didn't bring up the pattern. I didn't ask how success would be measured or recognized. I didn't clarify the scope or authority. I just said yes. Outwardly, nothing changed. My demeanor stayed steady. My output stayed strong. Inside, though, something shifted, not dramatically, but permanently. I began to notice how often my contributions were treated as infrastructure rather than authorship. How my calmness made others feel safe to delegate without discussion. How my reliability made it easy to forget that there was a person attached to the work. This wasn't a breaking point, it was a marker. The first time I realized that being indispensable doesn't protect you from being overlooked. It often guarantees it. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. After that first small cut, nothing exploded. There was no confrontation, no follow-up conversation, no apology that never came. Life simply continued. And that, in hindsight, was the most dangerous part. Because once something happens twice without consequence, the mind starts to file it under normal. The patterns didn't arrive dramatically. They repeated quietly, almost politely. My responsibilities expanded, but always framed as temporary. My input was requested, but usually after decisions had already been sketched out. I was brought in to refine, to stabilize, to make things work, not to decide what should exist in the first place. When new initiatives were announced, I was often already involved. Sometimes I had helped design them, but when leadership spoke about direction, my role was described as support, execution, implementation. I told myself this was just how organizations functioned, that not everyone needed a spotlight, that someone had to be the glue, and I was good at being glue. I smoothed transitions. I filled the gaps left by turnover. I answered questions no one else wanted to own. People trusted me because I didn't react emotionally, didn't posture, didn't complain. Trust, in this environment, became permission. Permission to add one more task, one more expectation, one more can you just... Each individual request made sense. Together, they formed something heavier than any job description I'd ever seen. There were moments when I almost spoke up. Small pauses in conversations where I could have said, "This is starting to look like a different role." Or, "We should probably formalize this." But every time, a voice in my head reminded me that things were going well, that rocking the boat would introduce uncertainty, that patience was part of professionalism. So I reframed the discomfort as discipline. I told myself I was learning, gaining exposure, building credibility. I told myself this was how you earned leverage, by being indispensable first. What I didn't admit was that I was also teaching people how to treat me. Because when you accept expanded responsibility without expanded authority, others learn that you will carry weight quietly. When you fix problems without naming their cost, others learn that your capacity is infinite. When you stay composed while being overlooked, others assume you're unaffected. None of this required bad intent. It only required consistency. At some point, I realized people were surprised when I wasn't available. Not disappointed, confused. As if my presence was part of the infrastructure, like Wi-Fi or lighting. Something you notice only when it's gone. That should have been a warning. Instead, I rationalized it as success. I told myself that being relied upon was a sign of value, that visibility would come later. Those titles were political, but substance mattered more. I told myself that speaking up too early would cheapen the work I was doing, so I stayed quiet. And silence, repeated often enough, becomes a language of its own. People began to speak around me instead of to me. Decisions were presented as conclusions rather than discussions. My manager would say things like, "You're flexible, right?" and would already move on before I could answer. And because I usually was flexible, the question became rhetorical. I wasn't angry. That's important. Anger would have forced clarity. What I felt instead was a dull, controlled discomfort. A sense that something was misaligned, but not yet broken. The danger of that feeling is how manageable it seems. You can live in it for years. You can convince yourself it's temporary, character building, strategic. You can normalize it until it feels irresponsible to challenge it. And that's exactly what I did. I normalized being overlooked. I normalized absorbing responsibility without recognition. I normalized the idea that my steadiness made me exempt from consideration, not because anyone demanded it, but because I allowed it. Looking back, this wasn't endurance. It was erosion, and erosion doesn't announce itself. It just quietly changes the shape of things until one day you no longer recognize the ground you're standing on. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled in gradually, like a shape coming into focus when you step back far enough. I wasn't just doing extra work. I had been placed into a role, One that was never discussed, never documented, and never questioned. A role that existed mostly in other people's expectations. I was the reliable one, the person who would handle it, the one who didn't need context or authority to fix a problem, the one you could assign responsibility to without formally assigning ownership. I wasn't expected to lead in the visible sense. I was expected to ensure nothing failed loudly, and once I saw that, I started noticing how consistently people interacted with me through that lens. When something went wrong, I was looped in immediately. When something went right, the credit floated upward. When a decision needed debate, I was informed after it was made. When execution needed certainty, I was asked to take charge. It wasn't that my contributions were dismissed, they were consumed. There's a difference. Dismissal ignores you, consumption uses you. People spoke to me in the language of assumption. You'll take care of this, right? We know you've got this. Can we lean on you for this one? Those phrases sound like trust, and in a way they are. But trust without boundaries becomes expectation. Expectation without recognition becomes entitlement. What made it harder to confront was that I was good at the role. I liked solving complex problems. I liked being the calm presence in chaos. I liked knowing how systems actually worked beneath the surface. The role fit my temperament, and that made it dangerous. Because when something fits you too well, it's easy to confuse comfort with fairness. I began to understand that my invisibility wasn't accidental, it was functional. If I were visible, my role would need definition. If my role were defined, it would need compensation. If it were compensated, it would need approval. Invisibility kept everything efficient, so the system rewarded my silence by giving me more responsibility, and punished any hint of visibility by framing it as unnecessary. I remember a moment when a newer colleague was promoted into a role adjacent to mine. He asked me, casually, "So what's your title again?" When I told him, he paused, just briefly, then said, "Oh, I assumed you were already leading this." That pause stayed with me longer than the conversation, because it confirmed something I had been avoiding. I was performing at a level that didn't match my position, and everyone knew it, except in the only ways that mattered. From that point on, I could see the role clearly. I was the stabilizer, the translator, the buffer. I absorbed pressure so others could remain polished. I turned vague direction into concrete results without asking for credit. And the more effective I was, the more entrenched the role became. I wasn't being groomed for advancement. I was being relied upon to maintain equilibrium. Those are not the same thing. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Not because I was afraid, but because I was beginning to understand that confrontation wouldn't change the role. It would only threaten the comfort built around it. People don't relinquish convenience easily, especially when it's quiet and reliable. So instead of pushing outward, I started paying attention inward. I began asking myself questions I had been avoiding. Not, why aren't they promoting me? But what happens if I stop performing this role? That question didn't demand an immediate answer, but it marked the end of something. The end of automatic compliance. The end of unexamined patience. The end of pretending the role was temporary. Because once you recognize the part you've been cast in, you can no longer claim you didn't know the script. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't happen after an argument, or a bad performance review, or a moment of public dismissal. In fact, no one else was present when it happened. That's what makes it hard to explain. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting at my desk, finishing up a document that summarized work I'd been doing for months. Process improvements, risk mitigation, handoff protocols. The kind of document that exists to make other people's lives easier. The kind that ensures continuity if someone senior decides to move on. I remember scrolling through it and realizing something that stopped me cold. If I removed my name from this document, nothing about the organization would change. But if I removed the document itself, several teams would struggle within weeks. That realization wasn't emotional, it was factual. I looked at my calendar. Meetings I wasn't leading but was expected to attend. Check-ins where I reported progress on initiatives I didn't officially own. Deadlines that depended on my input but weren't attributed to me. And, for the first time, I asked myself a question I had never seriously considered. Who benefits if I keep doing this exactly as I am? The answer was immediate, clear, uncomfortable. Everyone but me. That was the moment something shifted. Not outwardly, but internally. A recalibration, like a weight redistributing itself. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel wronged. I felt finished. Finished explaining. Finished, hoping someone would notice without being told. Finished assuming alignment would eventually materialize on its own. I realized I had been waiting for permission to value my own time, and no one was ever going to give it. What struck me most was how calm the realization was. There was no spike in emotion, no rush of adrenaline, just a steady clarity that settled in and didn't leave. I hadn't been patient. I had been postponing a decision. That afternoon, my manager messaged me asking if I could also take a look at an issue outside my scope. Normally, I would have said yes without thinking. This time, I stared at the message longer than usual, not because I was deciding whether to help, but because I was deciding whether my automatic yes still made sense. I didn't respond right away. That pause was new. In that pause, I noticed how conditioned I had become to immediate availability, how my value had slowly been measured by responsiveness rather than impact, how my silence had trained others to move forward without considering the cost. And in that pause, something else became clear. I didn't need to confront anyone to change the trajectory. I just needed to stop reinforcing the pattern, so I replied politely that I could look at it later in the week. Nothing dramatic happened. No pushback, no accusation. The world didn't end. But internally, that small boundary felt seismic. It wasn't a rebellion, it was alignment. From that day forward, I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could absorb. I started observing how people reacted when I didn't immediately fill the gaps. I paid attention to which requests were essential, and which existed simply because I had always said yes before. I didn't announce a change. I didn't explain myself. I just began acting as if my time had shape and limits. And once you do that, even quietly, you start seeing things differently. You notice how often urgency is manufactured, how frequently just this once is anything but, how quickly systems adapt when the easiest option becomes unavailable. That day didn't end with a resolution. It didn't fix anything overnight, but it marked the moment I stopped waiting to be recognized and started preparing to be intentional. And that, more than any confrontation, changed everything that followed. After that day, my silence changed character. Before, it had been passive, a byproduct of patience, polite semeness, and habit. Now, it was deliberate. Measured, chosen. Outwardly, very little looked different. I still showed up on time. I still delivered what I committed to. I still spoke calmly in meetings. If anything, I appeared exactly the same. Steady, agreeable, unthreatening. That's why no one noticed the shift. What changed wasn't my behavior, it was my consent. I stopped volunteering for things that weren't mine. I didn't announce this decision, I simply waited. When requests came without clarity, I asked questions instead of immediately acting. When timelines were vague, I asked who owned the outcome. When meetings drifted into areas where my presence wasn't necessary, I excused myself politely. None of this was confrontational, it was procedural. And because it was subtle, people interpreted it in familiar ways. They assumed I was busy. They assumed I trusted them to handle it. Some assumed I was disengaging. No one assumed I was repositioning myself. The most interesting reactions came when I said nothing at all. When a meeting ended without me summarizing next steps. When an email chain stalled because I didn't step in to clarify. When a problem lingered longer than usual because I didn't quietly resolve it in the background. At first, people filled the silence themselves. Someone else would jump in. Another team would take a guess. Things moved a little slower, a little messier. And I watched, not with satisfaction, with curiosity. I wanted to understand how much of what I had been doing was truly essential, and how much existed simply because I'd been there to catch it. The answer was uncomfortable. A lot of what I carried wasn't critical, it was convenient. I had been smoothing friction that should have been visible, absorbing ambiguity that should have forced decisions. By being reliable, I had been protecting the system from having to mature. And now, without announcing it, I was letting the system feel its own weight. People began to mistake my restraint for withdrawal. A few colleagues checked in casually, asking if everything was okay. I said it was, because it was. My manager noticed too, but not in the way I expected. He didn't ask about workload or boundaries. He asked if I was still interested in growing. The question surprised me, not because it was unfair, but because it revealed the assumption underneath it. That my growth was tied to my willingness to continue absorbing undefined responsibility. That ambition looked like availability. I answered honestly. I said I was very interested in growth, but that I wanted it to be intentional. The conversation moved on, no follow-up, no clarification. An ID on. That told me everything I needed to know. From their perspective, my silence looked like compliance turning into apathy. From mine, it was a focus. I was conserving energy, attention. And credibility. I was choosing where to engage instead of reacting to every pull. People often think power announces itself loudly, that it argues, demands, escalates. But real leverage tends to move quietly, especially at first. By not rushing to fill every gap, I was creating space. Space to observe, to document, to understand where the real dependencies lived. I started noticing which processes broke down without me, and which simply rerouted. I noticed who reached out directly and who waited. And most importantly, I noticed how little resistance there was to my restraint. No one pushed back hard. No one challenged me. No one tried to renegotiate my role. They just adjusted, which meant one thing was now undeniable. The silence I had maintained for years had never been required. It had just been convenient. And now that silence, chosen, intentional, was doing something very different. It wasn't protecting them anymore. It was protecting me. What they never noticed was that my silence had become observant. While things continued on the surface, meetings, emails, minor frictions, I was quietly paying attention to structure. Not personalities, not emotions. Structure. How decisions actually moved, where approvals stalled, which names appeared on documents, and which names didn't. I wasn't plotting, I was mapping. For years, I had operated on instinct and goodwill. Now I began operating on evidence. I started documenting everything I touched. Not in a dramatic way, not as a warning shot, just methodically. Processes I had inherited without context, fixes I had implemented without acknowledgement, dependencies that quietly ran through me even when my role wasn't mentioned. I wrote things down in my notebook at first. Dates, conversations, shifts in responsibility. Not to build a case against anyone, but to build a clear picture for myself. I wanted to know, without emotion, how much of the organization's stability depended on work that officially didn't exist. At the same time, I began learning in a different way. Before I learned to be useful, now I learned to be independent. I paid attention to which skills were organization-specific and which were transferable. Which knowledge lived only in my head, and which could be articulated cleanly to someone outside the system. I refined how I explained what I did, not in internal language, but in language that traveled well. I noticed how often people asked me to just jump on a call instead of formalizing requests. How much decision-making lived in hallway conversations and informal messages. That kind of ambiguity benefits those at the top. It exhausts those underneath. So I stopped absorbing it silently. When something mattered, I asked for it in writing. When expectations shifted, I summarized them in emails. When I was asked to own something temporarily, I asked what done looked like. None of this caused conflict. It caused clarity. And clarity, I realized, made some people uncomfortable. Not because it was aggressive, but because it removed deniability. What they also didn't notice was how I began repositioning my time. I stopped spending energy on work that merely made others look efficient. I invested it in work that made dependencies visible. I focused on outcomes that could be measured without interpretation. If something failed, I let it fail at its natural volume. I didn't rush into muting the consequences. That wasn't sabotage, it was honesty. And in that honesty, patterns became impossible to ignore. I saw how often my involvement had been used to smooth over incomplete decisions. How frequently leadership relied on my presence to compensate for the lack of alignment elsewhere. How my calm demeanor had allowed urgency to masquerade as planning. They never noticed this shift because I didn't announce it. I didn't change my tone. I didn't demand anything. I simply stopped protecting the system from its own shortcuts. At the same time, I began quietly preparing for the possibility that nothing would change. Not with bitterness, with pragmatism. I updated my understanding of the market. I spoke to people outside my organization, not to complain, but to calibrate. I wanted to know whether what I was experiencing was normal or simply normalized. The answer was sobering. It wasn't rare, but it wasn't inevitable either. I realized that my value wasn't being questioned. It was being contained. And containment only works when the person being contained cooperates. What surprised me most was how invisible this preparation was. No one sensed a shift in loyalty. No one asked if I was planning something. They assumed continuity because I had always provided it. And that assumption gave me time. Time to decide without pressure. Time to see the full shape of the system I was in. Time to understand where my real leverage lived. Not in confrontation, but in choice. Because leverage isn't loud. It doesn't threaten. It simply exists at the intersection of dependence and alternatives. And I was quietly standing right there. By the time I finished mapping, documenting, and reframing my own role in my mind, I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't hoping for recognition. I wasn't waiting for permission. I was prepared. And preparation changes how you see everything that follows. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where everything suddenly clicked into place. It arrived quietly, through accumulation, like a conclusion you reach not because of one fact, but because all the facts finally align. I was reviewing my notes one evening, flipping through pages I had filled over months. Timelines, process diagrams, names attached to decisions, and names conspicuously absent. I wasn't looking for anything specific, I was just checking my own understanding. And that's when I saw it. The work I'd been doing, what I'd been carrying, wasn't just helpful. It was structural. It connected systems that otherwise didn't speak to each other. It translated intent into execution in ways that weren't documented anywhere else. And most importantly, it had no formal owner, which meant two things were true at the same time. The organization depended on this work, and the organization had no obligation to protect the person doing it. That's when I understood where my leverage actually was, not in confrontation, not in demanding recognition, but in the simple fact that I could stop. Not abruptly, not emotionally, just deliberately. I realized that my value wasn't tied to how loudly I could assert myself. It was tied to how quietly the system assumed I would always be there. That assumption was the hinge everything swung on. And here's the part that surprised me most. Recognizing that didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel calm. There was no urge to expose anyone, no temptation to escalate, just clarity. Clean, unemotional clarity. For the first time, I could see my situation without personal distortion. I wasn't being singled out. I was occupying a role that systems create when competence meets silence. And I could step out of that role whenever I chose. That's leverage. I began testing this understanding carefully. I didn't withdraw all at once. I adjusted participation in ways that were reasonable, defensible, and professional. I declined meetings that didn't require my presence. I redirected questions back to their formal owners. I let decision-makers make decisions without my intervention. Nothing broke immediately, but things slowed. Questions that once came straight to me now bounced around longer. Issues that used to be resolved in hours took days. Not because I withheld knowledge, but because I stopped translating ambiguity into action. And still, no one said anything. That was the clearest signal of all. If my role had been truly recognized, there would have been concern. A conversation. An attempt to understand. Instead, there was an assumption that I would step back in if things became uncomfortable enough. They believed my silence was temporary. I knew it was intentional. This was the private reveal. I didn't need permission to change my position. I didn't need validation to make a decision. The system had already shown me exactly how it worked and where it was fragile. I also realized something else. Equally important. If I stayed, nothing would change. Not because people were malicious, but because systems optimize for comfort. As long as the discomfort landed on me quietly, there was no incentive to redistribute it. So the question in front of me wasn't, how do I fix this? It was, what do I want next? And that question didn't have an immediate answer, but it didn't need one yet. All it needed was honesty. I stopped hoping the organization would recognize my leverage. I accepted that it never had to. Leverage only needs to exist. It doesn't need to be acknowledged. That acceptance was grounding, because from that point on, every action I took was a choice, not a reaction. I wasn't maneuvering to be seen. I was positioning myself to move, cleanly, ethically, and without noise. There was no celebration in this realization. No sense of victory. Just a steady understanding that the balance had shifted internally, even if nothing had changed externally. And once that happens, you don't rush. You decide. Once you see the situation clearly, you can't pretend you don't. That's the quiet pressure of awareness. It doesn't rush you, but it doesn't let you rest either. After the private reveal, I found myself standing at a decision point that didn't announce itself as one. There was no deadline on my calendar, no ultimatum, just a growing understanding that staying undecided was, itself, a decision. I laid out my options carefully. I could speak up, formally, clearly. With evidence. Ask for a title adjustment, compensation alignment, and a redefinition of my role. On paper, this was the reasonable path, the professional one. It appealed to the part of me that still believed clarity would be met with fairness. But I also understood the risk. Speaking up would expose the imbalance without changing the incentive structure that created it. Best case, I'd receive a partial correction. Worst case, I'd be reframed as difficult, no longer quietly reliable, now inconveniently precise. I could also stay exactly where I was. Continue doing the work. Continue absorbing the gaps. Continue trusting that patience would eventually pay off. This path required the least disruption and the most self-denial. It would preserve stability for everyone else. And then there was the third option, the one that didn't require permission, negotiation, or validation. I could step away, not dramatically, not angrily, but decisively. This option carried the most uncertainty and the most finality. Once chosen, it couldn't be undone with an apology or a promise. It meant accepting that the organization might never acknowledge what I had carried, that I might leave without recognition, without closure, without the story resolving the way fairness suggests it should. That was the hardest part. Not fear of change, but letting go of the idea that staying would eventually make sense. I spent weeks sitting with these options. I didn't rush. I observed how I felt when I imagined each path, not how they looked, but how they settled in my body. Staying made me feel heavy. Speaking up made me feel alert, but constrained, as if I'd be bargaining within a frame I didn't choose. Leaving made me feel calm, not excited, not triumphant, calm. That calm mattered. It told me something my rational mind hadn't yet articulated. I wasn't trying to win within this system anymore. I was trying to step out of a role that no longer fit. The irreversible part wasn't the act of leaving. It was the internal decision to stop hoping the system would become something it wasn't designed to be. Once I accepted that, everything else followed naturally. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't even fully articulate it to myself at first. I just began aligning my actions with the path I had chosen. I focused on finishing commitments cleanly. I avoided starting anything new that would tether me further. I documented what needed to be documented, not out of obligation, but integrity. And I paid attention to how little resistance there was. No one pulled me aside to ask what I needed. No one noticed the gradual disengagement from future-facing work. The system kept moving, assuming I'd remain part of it. That assumption made the decision irreversible, because once you see that your presence is taken for granted rather than protected, staying becomes a form of self-betrayal. I didn't feel resentment. I felt resolved. The decision point wasn't loud. It didn't feel heroic. It felt like closing a door gently, knowing you won't open it again. Not because you're angry, but because you're done explaining why it should have been different. And from that moment on, everything I did moved in one direction. Quietly, deliberately, without asking for permission. Once the decision was made, there was no need to rush. That was the advantage of choosing quietly. Nothing on the outside demanded urgency, so I could move with precision instead of emotion. I didn't announce anything. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. I simply began aligning my life with the reality that I would not be staying. Most people imagine departure as an event, a conversation, a resignation letter. What they don't see is the long stretch before that moment, the part where everything is set in motion without anyone realizing it. That's where I was. I reviewed my finances first. Not because I was planning an escape, but because clarity requires preparation. I wanted to know exactly how much flexibility I had, how long I could operate without pressure, and what decisions would actually cost me something. Once I had that picture, the anxiety disappeared. Numbers have a way of grounding you. Then I turned to my work, specifically how entangled my identity had become with it. I began separating what belonged to me from what belonged to the organization. Knowledge I had built in my head, I translated into clean documentation. Not generously, not defensively, professionally. Enough that the system could function without me, but not so much that my role would remain invisible. I stopped being the unofficial historian. I stopped filling in context that no one had bothered to record. When asked questions that should have had owners, I redirected them, calmly, politely. In writing. This wasn't sabotage, it was alignment. At the same time, I made myself less central to future plans. When conversations drifted toward initiatives months away, I listened instead of contributing. When asked for opinions on long-term strategy, I deferred. I wasn't withdrawing, I was being honest about where I was investing my energy. And still, no one noticed. That's the part that stays with me. The organization was so accustomed to my quiet presence that even my gradual absence didn't register as a risk. My silence blended seamlessly into the background. Outside of work, I began rebuilding parts of myself that had been deferred. I reconnected with people I trusted, not to vent, but to recalibrate my sense of normal. I refined how I talked about my experience, not in internal language, but in terms that reflected scope, impact, and responsibility. The more I did this, the clearer it became how misaligned my position had been, and the calmer I felt. There were moments when I expected doubt to surface, when I thought I might second-guess myself or feel compelled to explain. It never came. Instead, I felt a steady confirmation that this was the right direction, not because the situation was unbearable, but because it was complete. At work, things continued as usual. Meetings happened. Requests came in. I fulfilled what I committed to, nothing more. My professionalism remained intact, which made my intentions invisible. People assume silence means stability. They don't realize it can also mean departure. What I was doing during this period wasn't dramatic or brave. It was respectful, to myself and to the people I worked with. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was simply refusing to continue in a role that required my erasure to function. By the time anyone would notice, everything would already be in place. That was the point, because real movement doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek approval. It just happens, quietly, cleanly, and on its own terms. And while no one else knew it yet, the consequences were already set in motion. The consequences didn't arrive as a crisis. They arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle. A meeting that ran longer than usual because no one quite knew how to close it. An email thread that circled back on itself without resolution. A decision that stalled because the person expected to translate it into action never quite did. That person used to be me, but because I hadn't left yet, because I was still present, still polite, still professional, no one connected the dots. They assumed the friction was temporary. A busy week, a one-off delay. What they didn't realize was that the system was experiencing itself without its buffer. People began asking more questions in meetings, not better questions, more questions. Clarifying things that had previously been handled quietly. Asking who owned what, waiting for direction that didn't arrive automatically. I watched this not with satisfaction, but with a kind of detached interest. This was the natural consequence of removing an unofficial role. Not a punishment, just reality. My manager noticed the delays first. Not as a pattern, but as irritation. He followed up more often. Asked for updates more frequently. Not because he was concerned about me, but because the flow he was used to had changed. What's the status on this? Have we heard back from that team? Can you help move this along? Each question assumed I was still the conduit. I answered carefully. I shared what I knew. I redirected where appropriate. I didn't step back into ownership. That's when the discomfort started to surface. People began to feel the absence of something they had never formally acknowledged. They couldn't name it, so they framed it as inefficiency, as miscommunication, as someone else dropping the ball. No one said, Andrew used to handle this, because saying that would raise another question they weren't ready to ask. Instead, the system did what systems do under strain. It looked for the fastest way to restore equilibrium. That usually meant asking me to just help out again. I declined gently, not with refusal, but with redirection. I pointed to the owners. I asked clarifying questions. I confirmed the scope. I stayed within my role. The result wasn't a collapse. It was exposure. Processes that relied on informal knowledge became visible. Decisions that had been rushed without alignment started to show cracks. Work that had been smoothed over began to show its edges. And still, no one confronted me. They didn't ask if I was overwhelmed. They didn't ask if something had changed. They simply worked harder around the friction, assuming it would resolve itself. That assumption was the cost of underestimating quiet labor. The most telling moment came when a senior leader asked, in passing, why a particular initiative was behind schedule. My manager gave a vague answer about cross-team dependencies. I was sitting right there. My name didn't come up. Not because it should have, but because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging how much had depended on work that wasn't officially recognized. So the system chose ambiguity over accountability. By this point, I felt strangely at peace. Not because things were unraveling, but because they were finally visible. The organization was experiencing the true cost of its structure without me absorbing it. And I wasn't angry about it. This wasn't a lesson I was teaching. It was a consequence unfolding naturally. I continued doing my job. Nothing more, nothing less. I remained respectful. I didn't explain my boundaries unless asked directly. And because no one asked directly, the gap widened. People felt it before they understood it. They sensed something was off, but couldn't locate it. They worked longer hours, sent more messages, scheduled more meetings. The system was compensating. What they were feeling wasn't my absence. It was the absence of invisibility. And once invisibility is removed, there's no easy way to put it back. The tone shifted before the words did. That was how I knew something had changed. People started reaching out with a different kind of energy. Not urgent, but unsettled. Messages became longer. Questions were framed more carefully. There was a new hesitancy in conversations, as if everyone sensed they were missing a piece but couldn't quite identify what it was. By the time the concern surfaced openly, the window for fixing it had already closed. My manager asked for a meeting, framed casually, of course. Just to sync. No agenda. That alone told me this wasn't about a task. It was about a feeling. We sat down, and he spoke in generalities. Things had been a little harder to coordinate lately. Some processes felt less smooth. A few initiatives weren't moving as cleanly as before. He didn't say my name in relation to any of it, but he didn't need to. I listened, nodded, asked clarifying questions, the same way I always had. Then he said something that revealed everything. We might need you to be a bit more involved again. Again, as if my involvement had been a setting that could simply be adjusted back to normal. I asked what he meant by that. He hesitated, spoke about collaboration, about stepping in where needed, about how things used to flow more easily. I waited. What never came was acknowledgement. Not of the role I'd been playing, not of the scope I'd been carrying, not of the fact that more involved meant resuming invisible labor without structure or recognition. The conversation drifted, circled, ended without resolution. That's when I knew it was too late. Not because they couldn't fix it, but because they still didn't see it clearly enough to fix it well. Over the next few weeks, similar conversations happened in fragments. A senior colleague asked if I'd be open to mentoring someone on processes I had effectively designed. Another asked if I could help document workflows that had lived in my head for years. Each request came with good intentions. None came with accountability. They were trying to patch symptoms without examining the cause. What they didn't understand was that the imbalance wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a structure. And structures don't change through favors. There was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when I sensed regret. Not spoken aloud, but implied in tone. A kind of quiet realization that something valuable had been taken for granted. But regret, when it arrives without responsibility, doesn't repair anything. It only confirms timing. I could have used these moments to renegotiate, to assert my value, to extract recognition at last. I didn't, because by then, my decision wasn't about leverage anymore. It was about integrity. Staying to fix something that only became visible when I stopped carrying it would have meant resuming the same role, just with better language attached to it. And language alone doesn't change incentives. I had already moved on internally. The confusion continued. Meetings multiplied. People tried to coordinate around gaps they couldn't quite define. Solutions were proposed, then retracted. Responsibility floated without landing. And through it all, no one asked the most important question. Why was one person carrying so much without it ever being formalized? That question, once asked honestly, changes everything. But asking it would have required admitting how long the imbalance had existed. So it went unasked. By the time leadership realized something fundamental had shifted, they were responding to consequences, not causes. And by then, the cause, my quiet withdrawal from an invisible role, was no longer negotiable. Not because I was angry, but because clarity, once reached, doesn't reverse itself. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like one. There was no raised voice, no defensive posture, no dramatic reveal. It was framed as a conversation, professional, measured, almost polite to a fault. I was asked to meet with my manager and a representative from HR. The invitation used neutral language. Alignment. Next steps. Words designed to lower tension before it exists. We sat in a small conference room with glass walls. People passed by outside, unaware of anything significant happening. That too felt appropriate. This wasn't a moment for spectacle. They started by thanking me for my contributions, for my reliability, for the way I'd kept things together. The phrases landed gently, but late. Then came the question I had been expecting for months. What do you want going forward? I answered simply. I described my role as it had actually been. Not my title, but my responsibilities. I outlined the scope I'd been carrying, the decisions I'd been translating into execution, the dependencies that had quietly run through me. I didn't accuse. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't use emotional language. I just described reality. There was a pause after I finished. Not because they disagreed, but because hearing it spoken plainly changed how it sounded. HR asked why this hadn't been raised sooner. I answered honestly. Because the work kept getting done. That was all. No blame, no justification, just a statement of fact. They asked if I would consider formalizing the role, adjusting the title, revisiting compensation. The words were careful now, chosen with intent. I listened, and for the first time I didn't feel the pull to negotiate. I told them I appreciated the recognition, that I understood the offer, and that I had already decided to move on. There was another pause. Longer this time. My manager looked surprised, not offended, just unsettled. He asked if there was anything that could change my mind. I thought about it before answering, not for effect, but for accuracy. I said no, not because the offer was insufficient, but because it arrived too late to change the underlying structure that had made it necessary. I explained that what I was stepping away from wasn't a title gap. It was a pattern, and patterns don't dissolve through retroactive corrections. They change only when the system is willing to see itself clearly. That wasn't something I expected them to do, and it wasn't something I was interested in waiting for. The conversation stayed calm throughout. There were no attempts to guilt me, no warnings, no defensiveness, just a quiet recognition that a decision had already been made, long before this meeting. They asked about the transition, documentation, knowledge transfer. I agreed to a reasonable timeline. I wasn't trying to create disruption. I just wasn't willing to continue carrying weight that no longer belonged to me. As we stood to leave, my manager thanked me again. This time his voice was different, more personal, less managerial. I nodded, said I appreciated the opportunity, and that was it. No triumph, no closure speech, just the end of a chapter that had already finished internally. Walking back to my desk, I felt lighter, not relieved exactly, but aligned. I hadn't won anything. I hadn't proven anything. I had simply told the truth without heat, and sometimes that's the most decisive confrontation there is. Who I am now isn't defined by what I left behind. For a long time, I thought walking away would feel like loss, like admitting defeat, or closing a door that I should have tried harder to keep open. What surprised me was how little resentment I carried with me. When the role finally fell away, so did the weight I had mistaken for responsibility. I didn't leave angry. I left completely. Today, I still value steadiness. I still prefer listening to speaking. I still believe that competence matters, but I no longer confuse restraint with obligation or silence with loyalty. The biggest shift wasn't external, it was how I relate to my own time. I understand now that availability is not a virtue by itself, that being relied upon doesn't mean being respected. And those systems don't change simply because someone endures them well. I work differently now. I define roles early. I clarify ownership. I ask what success looks like before I agree to contribute. Not because I'm guarded, but because I'm precise. When expectations expand, I address them in real time. Not defensively, not emotionally, just clearly. I don't wait for misalignment to become exhaustion, and I no longer assume that good work will automatically translate into good outcomes for the person doing it. That belief cost me more than I realized. What I gained in exchange was discernment. I'm better at recognizing patterns early, especially the ones that reward silence and penalize clarity. I'm better at choosing where to invest myself, and I'm more comfortable walking away from situations that require my invisibility to function. There's no bitterness in that, just self-respect. I don't see my past as wasted. It taught me how systems behave when left unchecked. It showed me how easily responsibility can drift without accountability. And it taught me that waiting to be recognized is rarely as powerful as choosing when to leave. The quietest lesson of all was this: you don't need to be acknowledged to be decisive. Leaving didn't make me louder, it made it clearer. I didn't redefine myself by opposing what happened. I redefined myself by understanding it and refusing to repeat it. If there's dominance in that, it isn't aggressive. It's internal. It's the kind that doesn't need to be proven, because it's already aligned with action. I still believe in doing good work. I just no longer believe in disappearing for it. Looking back now, the story doesn't feel dramatic. It feels precise. There was no single villain, no explosive betrayal. Just a slow misalignment between responsibility and recognition, and a long period where I mistook endurance for integrity. If there's a moral here, it isn't about leaving early or staying too long. It's about awareness. Systems don't exploit people loudly. They do it quietly, through habit, convenience, and unspoken expectations. And they continue doing it for as long as the cost is absorbed by someone who doesn't make noise. For a long time, that someone was me. I believed that being calm would protect me, that being reliable would eventually be rewarded. that if I carried enough weight without complaint, someone would notice and respond with fairness. What I learned instead is this: systems don't correct what doesn't disrupt them. Silence is often interpreted as consent, not because people are cruel, but because they're busy, incentivized, and comfortable with what works. And if something works, even unfairly, it tends to continue. The turning point in my story wasn't confrontation, it was clarity. Once I saw the pattern clearly, I couldn't unknow it. I couldn't continue performing a role that required my invisibility, not because it hurt, but because it erased choice. Walking away wasn't an act of defiance, it was an act of alignment. I didn't leave to punish anyone. I left because staying would have meant teaching myself the wrong lesson, that my time was infinitely available, that my boundaries were negotiable, and that my value existed only when it was convenient to others. None of that is true. What I hope you take from this story isn't a script to follow, but a question to sit with. Where in your life are you carrying responsibility that no one has formally acknowledged? Not out of generosity, but out of habit. And if you're carrying it quietly, ask yourself why. Is it strategic? Is it temporary? Or is it simply familiar? There's no shame in staying, and there's no virtue in leaving just to make a point. The only real mistake is remaining unaware, because awareness is what gives you choice. Quiet dominance isn't about winning arguments or forcing recognition. It's about knowing when your silence serves you, and when it serves everyone else at your expense. Sometimes the strongest move isn't to speak louder, it's to step away calmly, with integrity intact, and let the absence tell the truth that words never could. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived some version of it, or you're living it now, I'd like to hear your perspective. Have you ever realized that you were being promoted in responsibility, but never in title or pay? And how did you decide what to do next?